a lot of recent conservative and libertarian angst that we Americans are feeling from our friends, quote unquote, across the pond who are threatening to arrest Americans, Ian, if we violate the UK's speech law. I mean, literally threatening violence, meaning extraditing us violently from the United States to the UK if we violate their speech laws. Now, I notice, Ian, you have a bit of an accent, so I wonder where you stand on this issue.
Yeah, I think it's appalling. It's honestly one of the most disgusting things I've seen in a very long time. I think if you look at what the United Kingdom has done in world history, what they've achieved, the kind of freedoms they brought to parts of the world, ending world slavery. The United Kingdom stood alone for really the first part of World War II against Nazism and fascism in Europe. And now there are a bunch of overweight dweebs who are bowing down to radical Islam while arresting grannies for saying the wrong thing. I think it's absolutely appalling. The country that in many ways brought us free speech is now throwing it down the toilet. I think it's absolutely revolting to watch. It's difficult because it's so laughable, the idea of them threatening to extradite Americans. I mean, if Kamala Harris is president, that may happen. But if Donald Trump is president, I think he would just tell people to go F themselves. But it says so much about the deeper issue, which is the complete lack of respect for freedom of speech and why it is so important to any civilization, certainly the Western civilization. Without freedom of speech, we don't have anything, because you don't have freedom of thought, you don't have freedom to believe what you want, you don't have freedom to actually push back against the regime. This all implodes into just a disgusting level of authoritarian power that I think the UK is just embracing, and it's really just so upsetting to see. It's hard for me to believe, honestly, in really such a few short years, we've just turned into 1984. George Orwell was just 40 years too late.
I mean, you're the country of Margaret Thatcher, right? I mean, you're the nation of Winston Churchill, great conservative thought leaders who have left an indelible mark on history. What happened to your former country, Ian?
I think a lot of this is honestly the wider problem we're seeing in the United States as well. The United States is slightly isolated from this just by nature of distance, but a complete lack of love for Western culture. I think the idea that you can be proud of Western culture, proud of being British, proud of being an American, proud of being French, proud of being Italian, all of these things, that's looked down upon. And then people have just been importing by the millions people from cultures who are actively trying to consume our culture. The idea that all cultures are equal. They're simply not. You have stories coming out in the Middle East right now of people trying to lower the age of consent to 9 years old. Like, all cultures are not equal. That is not controversial to say. That is not racist to say. If that is racist to say, then you're going to have to explain to me why it's okay to say that white supremacy is a disgusting ideology, which it is. But you can't criticize, say, radical Islam in the same way. But a lot of this is a fear of being politically incorrect, a fear of saying the wrong thing, a fear of offending the wrong people. Meanwhile, people are coming in and laughing at us behind our back while they're taking over Western culture, and we're handing them it on a platter. I think that's the really appalling thing. It isn't even a battle. I'm certainly not calling for violence or riots on the streets. I think that's part of this conversation we should also have. But the fact that people who are angry when it comes to immigration policy and the impact it has on societies, just look at the explosion of violence, look at the explosion of crime, rapes, murders that are connected with illegal immigrants in the United States. Like, policy has direct outcome and a direct impact on people. And if you are shut up for saying that, then the only people left are the people opening the door for these people.
Yeah.
And what's happening in the UK is what could happen here in, I'd say, 10, 15, 20 years' time, perhaps, is that if you get rid of free speech and you really justify fascism, which is what this is, you justify fascism under the guise of not hurting people's feelings, you go down a path that it's very hard to come back from.
Yeah, I think right-wing protests like this are pointless unless you actually have some kind of a plan to overthrow your government, because what they're going to do to you is what they did to the January 6ers times 10. I mean, the UK government has been clamoring for an opportunity to clamp down on the political opponents of the UK government, and now they've got the opportunity to do so. And I imagine that a lot of these people who were involved in the UK protests and riots are going to go to gulags here very soon. But Ian, I've got a two-part question for you on this one. One, are things like this the reason that you left? And two, isn't it a problem that if people who believe what you believe leave the UK, that it's only going to get worse?
Yeah, I mean, this isn't the reason I left, because I left to go work in software engineering. So it was It was primarily a matter of just opportunities here were better. It's certainly a reason I will never go back to live there, because I think once you've experienced actual freedom, you can't go back, right? It's something that you couldn't imagine leaving. I love visiting England. I have family and friends there and love to go back. But there's a huge difference between visiting somewhere as a tourist and living there. And I think the kind of freedoms you have here don't compare to anywhere else. Like freedom in America is really incomparable to the lack of freedom in Europe we're seeing. But in terms of like where this is going, I think a lot of this does hinge on people leaving, but it's also the right people standing up. A lot of this, I think a lot of people incorrectly blame individuals for this kind of problem, when really this is a failure of leadership. This is a failure of conservative leadership in the UK. And I think my criticism has been for a long time that people like Tommy Robinson, for example, Americans don't really know who he is. Let me tell you, he is a piece of crap. He's a terrible human being. He was a leader of a white supremacist group in the United Kingdom for a long time. He intentionally fuels violence and fuels hatred, fuels rioting, all this kind of thing. And often from Spain or other holiday places that he's going, he intentionally tries to get arrested and then plays victim. He's a bad character. But the problem is with someone like Tommy Robinson, he didn't just erupt in a vacuum. He is a result of fecklessness and weakness on the broader conservative side, who have just stood back and let this conversation be taken over by someone like Tommy Robinson. So if you're someone like me who doesn't like Tommy Robinson, but you're not speaking out against attacks on free speech, attacks on Western culture, then you don't really have a leg to stand on, because you have completely abandoned this debate to the worst people. In the same way that moderate leftists in England or classical liberals have completely ignored the defense of Western culture, they are to blame for the radicalism on the left. And I think a lot of conservatives in the UK, specifically conservative leaders, I mean, they had conservative power in the UK for well over a decade. And what did they do with it? Nothing, absolutely nothing. What they did is they slowly eroded the image of what it is to be conservative, even British conservatism, which is nothing like American conservatism. And then they handed power to the Labour Party, and goodness knows how long they'll have it for. And look what has happened in just a few short weeks. And so I think a lot of this, individuals, I completely understand if you're an individual person leaving for a better life in you and your family. I think everyone should do that if they're able to. But I think a lot of this, I point the finger squarely at leaders who have failed for decades to stand up for what is right and to say the difficult thing, because it's difficult, it's uncomfortable. But if you're not willing to say the truth in a position of leadership, you do not deserve the title of leader.